The exhaustion in her eyes told a story that 40 years couldn't fully capture. Linda Hayes, 64, sat in the middle section of the Tonight Show studio, still wearing the small silver pin on her cardigan that read, St. Mary's Hospital, 40 years of service. Her hands, weathered from decades of washing, IV insertions, and comforting touches, rested quietly in her lap as she watched Jimmy Fallon work the crowd with his usual energy. It had been exactly 72 hours since Linda walked out of St. Mary's Hospital for the last time as an employee. 4 decades of night shifts, double overtime during flu seasons, and the kind of selfless care that had earned her the nickname Angel Linda among patients and families. She'd started as a young nursing school graduate in 1984, fresh-faced and eager to heal the world. She was ending her career as one of the most beloved nurses in the hospital's history. The Tonight Show tickets had been a retirement gift from her nursing unit, the same colleagues who had thrown her a surprise party in the break room, complete with a cake that read, Our Hero, and photos from 4 decades of Christmas parties, baby showers, and late-night coffee breaks that had sustained them through the hardest moments in medicine. Linda hadn't wanted to come alone, but her daughter lived in California, and her colleagues were working the night shift she'd left behind. Go anyway, Mom, her daughter had insisted over the phone. You deserve to laugh after everything she'd been through. The phrase felt inadequate for what Linda had witnessed and endured, especially these past 5 years. She'd worked through the entire COVID pandemic, watching colleagues fall ill, holding iPads so dying patients could say goodbye to families who couldn't visit, working 16-hour shifts when the hospital was overwhelmed and understaffed. She'd lost count of how many families she'd comforted, how many last hands she'd held, how many times she'd been the only familiar face in someone's final moments. The pandemic had taken its toll on every healthcare worker, but nurses like Linda, the ones who couldn't work from home, couldn't zoom into their responsibilities, had carried the weight of the world's pain in ways that would mark them forever. It was a Tuesday night taping in March, and Jimmy was in fine form. He'd just finished interviewing a popular comedian about his new Netflix special, and the audience was warm and responsive. Spring was finally arriving in New York, and there was an energy of renewal in the studio that matched the season. During a commercial break, Jimmy was doing his usual walk through the audience, shaking hands and taking selfies. He moved through the rows with practiced ease until he reached Linda's section, and something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Linda sat with perfect posture despite her obvious fatigue. Maybe it was the hospital pin that caught the studio lights. Maybe it was simply the quiet dignity she carried, the way some people radiate a lifetime of service, even in silence. Ma'am, I love your pin, Jimmy said, pointing to the silver hospital insignia. Do you work at St. Mary's? Linda looked up, startled to be noticed. I did, she said softly. Just retired 3 days ago. 40 years. The simple statement carried enormous weight. Jimmy had become skilled at reading people during his years of hosting, and something about Linda's tone, pride mixed with exhaustion, accomplishment shadowed by loss, made him step closer. 40 years as a nurse, Jimmy asked, his voice shifting from entertainer to genuine conversation. Yes, started when I was 24, finished last Friday. Night shift, mostly ICU and emergency. A murmur went through the nearby audience members. Healthcare workers had become recognized heroes during the pandemic, but hearing about 4 decades of service to others felt especially profound. Jimmy made a decision that would change the course of the evening. Would you mind if I asked you to come down here for a minute? I think there's some people who'd like to properly thank you. Linda looked uncertain. Oh, I don't need any fuss. I just did my job. That phrase, I just did my job, was perhaps the most common thing Jimmy had heard from true heroes over the years. The people who deserved recognition most were often the ones who thought they deserved it least. Ma'am, with respect, you didn't just do a job for 40 years. You saved lives. You comforted families. You were probably the first person many babies saw when they came into this world, and the last kind face many people saw when they left it. And the audience around them began to applaud, understanding they were witnessing something special. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Please, Jimmy said gently, let us say thank you properly. Linda stood slowly, her knees protesting after the long day of retirement paperwork and farewell visits. As she made her way down to the stage, the applause grew, spreading through the studio as word passed about who she was and what she represented. When Linda reached the stage, Jimmy helped her up the steps and guided her to the center where he usually conducted interviews. But this wasn't an interview, this was something entirely different. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced to the full studio, this is Linda Hayes. She just retired after 40 years as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital here in New York. 40 years of taking care of all of us. The applause erupted again, but Jimmy raised his hand for quiet. Linda, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no wrong answer. What was it like 40 years of caring for people at their most vulnerable moments? Linda looked out at the audience, then back at Jimmy. For a moment, she seemed overwhelmed by the attention. Then she found her voice. It was an honor, she said simply, every single day, even the hardest ones. It was an honor to be trusted with people's lives, their fears, their hopes. You get to be there for the miracles, the babies born, the patients who recover against all odds, and you get to be there for the heartbreaks too, holding someone's hand when they're scared, helping families say goodbye. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. People always ask me about the sad parts, the losses, but what they don't understand is that being present for someone's last moments, making sure they're not alone, making sure they're comfortable and loving, that's not sad work, that's sacred work. The studio was completely silent. Even the crew members had stopped their usual between segments activities to listen. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. You mentioned the pandemic. I can only imagine what these past few years have been like for you. Linda's expression changed, the weight of recent memories crossing her face. The pandemic it was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. We lost colleagues. We worked with equipment shortages. We held tablets so families could say goodbye through a screen when they couldn't be there in person. She paused, collecting herself. But you know what I remember most? The way people stepped up, the way communities supported us, the signs in yards thanking healthcare workers, the meals delivered to the hospital, the kids who drew pictures for us. It reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place, because people are basically good and they take care of each other. Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. Linda, I want to give you this, not because I want anything from you, but because I want you to know that what you shared tonight matters. You've spent 40 years taking care of others. Now it's time for others to take care of you. But Jimmy wasn't finished. He turned to address the audience directly. I want everyone here to understand something. Linda Hayes represents thousands of healthcare workers who have dedicated their lives to taking care of the rest of us. They work nights, weekends, holidays. They miss family dinners and school plays and birthday parties because they're taking care of strangers who become their responsibility. He looked back at Linda. You said you just did your job, but I want you to know something. Your job was saving lives. Your job was being there when people needed you most. Your job was 40 years of putting other people first. The audience rose to their feet as one. This wasn't prompted applause. It was spontaneous recognition of a lifetime of service. The standing ovation went on for nearly 3 minutes, with audience members openly crying and some shouting, "Thank you." Linda stood there, overwhelmed by the response. After 40 years of working largely unnoticed night shifts, to have her service recognized so publicly was almost too much to process. There's something else, Jimmy said as the applause finally died down. We contacted St. Mary's Hospital before the show tonight. Linda looked confused. What do you mean? They wanted to make sure you knew something. In your 40 years of service, you were nominated for the Daisy Award. That's the highest honor for nurses, 12 different times. You won it 3 times. Your colleagues wanted you to know that you weren't just doing your job, Linda. You were excelling at it. It's Linda gasped, bringing her hand to her mouth. I didn't know about the nominations. Your colleagues also wanted you to know that the new family comfort room in the ICU, the space where families can rest and process difficult news, is being named the Linda Hayes Family Room. Your legacy isn't just the patients you saved, it's the standard of compassion you set for everyone who works there. Now, Linda was openly sobbing, but they were tears of joy mixed with disbelief. 40 years of humble service, and she'd had no idea of the impact she'd made. Jimmy had one more surprise. And finally, Linda, we know that retirement isn't always easy after such a long career. So, The Tonight Show and our sponsors have set up a fund in your honor. It's going to provide scholarships for nursing students who want to work in emergency and critical care, the areas where you spent your career. The audience erupted again, understanding they were witnessing something special. Linda stood there, hands over her face, overwhelmed by the recognition and the knowledge that her work would continue through others. I don't know what to say, Linda whispered. You don't have to say anything, Jimmy replied. You've already said it all through 40 years of service. As they helped Linda back to her seat, the entire audience remained standing, continuing to applaud. But more than applause, there was something deeper happening, recognition of the everyday heroes who work among us, the people who dedicate their lives to caring for others without seeking recognition. The episode that aired 3 weeks later became one of the most shared Tonight Show segments of the year. It sparked a national conversation about healthcare workers and the sacrifices they make. Nursing schools across the country reported increases in applications, with many prospective students citing Linda's story as inspiration. Linda herself was invited to speak at nursing graduations and healthcare conferences. She discovered that retirement didn't mean the end of her service. It meant the beginning of a new kind of contribution, inspiring the next generation of caregivers. 6 months later, Linda returned to The Tonight Show for a planned segment about the scholarship fund that had been established in her honor. By then, it had grown to support 50 nursing students annually. People ask me if I miss the work, Linda told Jimmy during her return visit. I miss the patients, I miss my colleagues, but I don't miss the exhaustion. And knowing that these scholarships are helping young people become nurses, that feels like my work is continuing. The Linda Hayes Family Room at St. Mary's Hospital became a place of comfort for thousands of families facing medical crises. A plaque by the door reads, "In honor of Linda Hayes, RN, who taught us that healing begins with compassion." And at St. Mary's Hospital, every new nurse receives a small silver pin with Linda's favorite saying engraved on it. Nursing is not just what you do, it's who you are. Because sometimes the most important work happens in the quiet moments between one shift and the next, when someone who has devoted their life to caring for others finally gets the recognition they've always deserved but never sought. And sometimes a simple thank you can transform a career's worth of service into a legacy that will heal hearts for generations to come.